So yesterday we talked a little bit about the new urban agenda, which is really the sort of main topic of the course, but also what the new urban agenda tells us about the context that we're in today, the challenges we have, but also the models and methods we've been using to deal with our challenges, and where maybe they're not sufficient, they're lacking some important uh, insights, some important ways of approaching our problems that we're going to need if we're going to make any progress on those problems. Um, and I've asked you to read the New Urban Agenda, which is quite a dense document. It's, as often these documents are, it's got a lot of repetitive language and language that might at first glance seem like it's not very meaningful, or at least not very specific in terms of what the language means. But that's the result of a lot of people coming together and negotiating and saying, well, I want this word and you can't use that word. I'll agree to it if you use this other word. For example, one of the issues that came up was the idea of the right to the city. And that is an idea that has had a lot of currency, but also a lot of controversy among some, especially some national governments, who see that as a potential form of unrest, a potential form of even threat to governance. And so that terminology got changed to cities for all, the idea that cities should be open to all and welcoming to all, and that people should have the ability to find opportunities and find ways of improving their well-being and their quality of life. All people, regardless of their background, their income, their ethnicity, anything else. So there's a lot of language in the new urban agenda that addresses these kinds of issues of inclusion and equity and participation by vulnerable populations, by women and children and people who sometimes are excluded or have been excluded historically, and so on. And there was a lot of negotiation about those kinds of issues. But what there wasn't as much negotiation about, and I find interesting actually, is the basic principles of cities and what cities should do for us as human beings, what cities are as constructs, really, and how that has changed over the last 75 years or so, which is what really this course is all about, how the changing picture of the sciences has influenced the changing picture of cities. Before we get into the specifics of the new urban agenda, I want to address this idea that it is a new paradigm. This is what Juan Clos, the Secretary General of Habitat 3, asserted, that this is really a landmark change in the way that we're looking at cities. And I think that's a fair statement, actually. I think the evidence supports that claim. And I'll talk about that in relation to what we might think of as the old paradigm, the paradigm that has led us to make cities the way we have been making them, and in some ways are still making them today. The model of city making. And I'm going to dive into that in more detail and try to understand how it arose, why it seemed like a very good idea at the time, very well-intentioned way of thinking about cities, and what were some of the shortcomings of it. You remember yesterday we talked about this essay by Rem Koolhaas talking about the alchemistic promise of modernism, transforming quantity into quality through abstraction and repetition, leaving us in a kind of crater of our understanding of modernity and modernization. This is the idea of a postmodern world, a world where the ideals that we had about modernity and modernism as a movement had in some ways come crashing down against some of the realities of, again, our very successes, the very things that we achieved with modernity, the mechanization, the rationalization, the industrialization, the incredible prosperity by historic standards that we generated, has also created all of these unintended consequences. And this is the crater of modernity that has left us, in some cases, destroying the very buildings that we had built just a couple of decades earlier. You've probably heard about all of these famous demolitions of building projects that were built just a couple of decades earlier for a variety of reasons. Often they're hotly debated, but in any event, those buildings in many cases have been destroyed, and yet we're building more of them, more new buildings all the time, more tall buildings and so on. And so there are some issues that we have to debate and come to terms with when we think about whether this is really a sustainable approach. Clearly, it's not sustainable if we're destroying the very buildings that we've just created a few decades earlier. But let's look back at the historic era in which modernism as a movement and modernity as a kind of altruistic project began. This was in the 19th century when industrialization was moving very rapidly, and we were creating, one can say, horrific conditions in the cities. Certainly in England, that was true. And in other cities that were industrializing around that time, you had high degrees of concentrations of poverty, of disease, of problems with sanitation, problems with overcrowding, et cetera. And there were a lot of people who were rightly very, very concerned about that and believed that the problem was in the nature of cities themselves, that we needed to rethink how to make cities according to a different model, a model that allowed people, for example, to have more open space, more green space, more fresh air, more ability to get out and enjoy the natural environment. And one of the most important was Ebenezer Howard in the late 19th century and early 20th century, one of the major proponents of the Garden Cities movement. And this was the idea that you take the pieces of the city that are currently too closely packed and creating disruptions and problems, and you separate them out. You put them into the countryside. You keep the central city only as the sort of core of activity, and then you pull the city apart into these garden cities, as he called them. We would call them suburbs today, where you had different components. And if you look carefully at his drawing, it's quite remarkable that he had sort of a place for everything and everything in its place. You had the epileptic farms, the homes for waifs, the homes for inebriates, etc. And you had a highly segregated, functionally segregated scheme of pulling the pieces of the city apart and putting them all in different places across the rural landscape, actually, and creating a different kind of city, a garden city, as he referred to it. And this is Welland Garden City in the UK. This is the densest part of Welland. It's actually fairly low density, the major part of it, with a lot of single family homes and row homes and so on. But again, it's a very sort of rationalized scheme, very axial, very radial, very sort of well organized, a place for everything and everything in its place. Now, there was a fateful change in that way of thinking about the city, because if you remember what we were talking about, the idea of mixing, the idea of dynamism, the idea of a complex adaptive system that brings elements together and allows them to have a sort of critical mass. This is not that approach. This is a very different approach of pulling the elements apart and putting them into very separated locations across the landscape, so that if you lived in one of these Garden City neighborhoods and you worked in the center, you were now going to have to commute back and forth, back and forth, back and forth every day. And that was a very fateful model that was adopted in many cities around the world. This idea that the suburbs are now the bedrooms for the central city, and the central city is where you put the dangerous stuff and get, especially the families and women and children and so on away from all of that. And that you do the same thing within the garden city. You segregate out the components, and you put the commerce at the edges of the neighborhood, and you put the schools and the parks at the center. That's where the women and the children would go to. So again, you're not only segregating the uses, you're segregating the people, and you're doing it according to a model that was at that time very, one could say simplistic, or let's put it this way, one would have very clear roles in life. The women had one role, the men had another role, the children were taken care of by the women, and so on. Very different than what many people think of today in how cities operate. A related movement around the same time was the City Beautiful movement. And it was, by the way, a very neoclassical movement, very much about beautifying and creating classical forms within the cores of the cities, making them very beautiful. But once again, you were segregating the uses out. You were removing all of the commerce in many cases, or removing the residential areas and creating monofunctional zones. This is Washington, D.C. And what you had prior to the City Beautiful movement in Washington, D.C. was all of the uses were mixed in the core area of the city. Once the City Beautiful movement came, this became a gigantic museum district that really, and with the government's buildings and so on, and it pretty much emptied out at 5 p.m. in the afternoon when everybody left that district and went home. Once again, segregating out all the uses, creating a monofunctional zone, and then other parts of the city were also monofunctional zones. Another movement not too many years later was Le Corbusier's radiant city, which was the idea, once again, of segregating out the functions and segregating out the buildings. Now, the idea that you pull the buildings away from the streets, and the streets are now these nasty, dangerous places where only vehicles go. You don't want people around those. You want people up in the towers where they're going to be able to get away from the dust, smells, and noise. And they're up in the towers amidst clean air and trees and grass, and the whole town is verdure clad, as he put it. So once again, the idea that the way cities existed at that time was dangerous, inherently dangerous, because of the mixing, because of the fact that you had people interacting with one another in this web. You wanted to pull that web apart and put people into these more rationally segregated elements, in this case, towers in the park, as Le Corbusier referred to them. And this was the model that was very much the model for post-war development around the world. You can see this model right through to today being built right around the world. The buildings are maybe not quite up to what Le Corbusier would consider beautiful, but this is the model of segregating the buildings away from the transportation modes. The transportation was now dominated by automobiles and vehicles of various kinds, and pedestrians were relegated to another realm, separated from all of that. So again, in 1923, you have Le Corbusier writing Towards a New Architecture, describing the radiant city. 1938, you have the World's Fair stretching into 1939, where that model was celebrated through this wonderful exhibit, the exhibit by General Motors, in fact, designed by Norman Bell Geddes, illustrating what exciting new world this was going to be. And millions of people came through that exhibit and were absolutely enthralled by this idea of building cities in this way, including many mayors, many city officials, many planners, many developers, and it held the world in thrall, I think it's fair to say. Remember, this was right before World War II. So after World War II ended, this was now the way to turn our backs on this painful painful history and create a new world that was completely different from everything that we had experienced before, and hopefully would leave behind all the horrors that we had experienced before and create a shining new world, so to speak. And this is the world that we created, of course. This is Dallas in about 2000 or so, Dallas, Texas, and, you know, very much built according to that radiant city model. If you see down in the lower right here, that is exactly what we've been doing right around the world. We've been creating the world of automobiles and parking lots and freeways and monofunctional neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods in most cases, with maybe a park or a shopping center in the center of that or at the edge of that. And creating this world of towers in the park, or maybe not so much towers in the park, but towers in the parking lot, in what ended up being the case. This, by the way, was Le Corbusier's plan for rebuilding a huge section of Paris on the North Bank there. You can see this is the Notre Dame Cathedral down here, and this entire area up on the 3rd arrondissement would be bulldozed and replaced by this plan Voisin that he did for the Voisin automobile company. So again, this was a very much an integrated model with the industrialization that was going on, especially around the car. The General Motors I mentioned before, Alfred P. Sloan, the president, was famous for saying what's good for General Motors is good for the USA. So this was a model that even though when it was originally developed in Europe, there was a progressive allure to it. Certainly, the idea that we were going to humanize the world, and certainly Ebenezer Howard was a progressive and wanted to see conditions improved for human beings. I think that was very, very sincere goals. And yet what happened was very much a sort of coupling of industry to this vision, and the idea that industry could now do no wrong because what's good for General Motors is good for the USA. What's good for the Voisin car company is good for Paris, and et cetera. And so this is, I think, a fateful turn in the relationship between design and building and architecture and urbanism and industrialization. The embrace of industrialization at a breathtaking pace. By the way, a little side note, if you go back to England and the progressive movement there and the arts and crafts movement that was going on at that time, they had a critical relationship to industrialization. They thought that the role of architects and designers and planners and reformers was to have a critical understanding of how industrialization was to be managed, and in some ways perhaps restricted even, as opposed to the more exuberant model that was certainly true in Germany. The idea that in the Bauhaus, for example, that we were going to embrace industrialization. We were going to become the designers who would harness industrialization towards humane ends, and that would create a new world that would be for the worker, for the formerly oppressed people, and improving the lot of those people. So there was certainly a very strong idealism behind this movement, but at the same time, there was also one could say, a pretty clear lack of critical understanding of what the dangers could be, certainly in the German model, perhaps more so than the English model. Although again, with Ebenezer Howard, you see a pretty exuberant approach to this idea of segregating out the parts of the city. Again, you're replacing a lot of the fabric that had already existed in, for example, Paris, and what Haussmann had done when he came in with the interventions of the major boulevards and this very sort of formal top-down, a very sort of city beautiful kind of approach to Paris. But what you saw with Le Corbusier was an even more radical scheme, which was to not simply slice through the older fabric and sort of reorganize it as Haussmann did in the mid 1800s, but wipe it out and replace it with a new model. So it was a much more radical scheme in many ways. And you've seen that in certainly in Poland, in many parts of the country and many parts of Europe after World War II, in areas that had been heavily damaged by bombing were replaced very quickly by panelized construction of buildings that in many cases did not perform very well, as you probably know. But again, this was a model that we had embraced enthusiastically as something that was going to be a vision of a much more utopian future, that technology was going to solve our problems, that we're going to become politically enlightened. We had the romance of the new, we had the mechanical technology as the ordering idea. I think it's fair to say that we've lost all of those now, all of that idealism, but we still have the mechanical technology. And this is the sort of crater of modernity that Rem Koolhaas referred to. And in some ways, you might say that it is that Koolhaas is in effect at the bottom of that crater, still rearranging the bits of the rubble, the mechanical technology, to see what kinds of interesting and expressive artistic statements and structures can be made. And they are very interesting and expressive structures, but they are certainly not changing what it has happened before in terms of the mechanical technology, because I think Koolhaas believes, not to put words in his mouth, but I think it would be fair to say that he does not believe that we can get past that we are really mired in this crater and there's no way out. So what we need to do is to recognize our condition and perhaps deconstruct it. That's another movement that I'm sure you're probably familiar with, the idea of deconstruction in language, which is that you can't necessarily change the power structure, but you can reveal that power structure. You can deconstruct it through your artistic expressions. And that is at least one form of progress, in a sense, to reveal the truth about your condition. So again, very rational, idealistic goals that resulted in often irrational, unanticipated consequences, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or air pollution or health problems from lack of exercise or air quality impacts on human health, asthma, of course, segregation of populations, because now you were going to have problems with people who didn't own a car and couldn't own a car if you become too car dependent, as many cities did. And then the public transportation becomes a sort of second-class citizens mode, as it has in many parts of the world. So again, this is the world that we've built. And again, when we segregate these urban elements, we have encapsulated human beings in the capsule of the home, going to the capsule of the workplace, through the capsule of the car, or maybe the capsule of the transportation vehicle. But there is no real public space in this scheme. There is no mixing on the street and on the sidewalk and in the public arenas that you had before. You'd have no tissue of public space in the way that you had before. For all its problems, the model on the right did allow a lot of mixing, a lot of social lubrication, if you will, ability of people to meet other people and to share ideas and to create a kind of ferment, a kind of mix of ideas and mix of opportunities that the research is now showing was really creating a lot of the growth that we see in cities that can take, for example, a penniless immigrant from Italy and bring them to a city like New York and allow them and their children and grandchildren to, in due course, become shopkeepers and professors and musicians and other people who take their place in a complex society and create more wealth, more cultural richness in that place as well. Whereas the model on the left, once again, is pulling away all of those elements and rationally segregating all the people. There isn't really much public space in that scheme. There are long pedestrian passageways, you notice, but not a lot of mixing. In fact, those can become quite long and strung out places with very few encounters between people in them. If you've ever been to, for example, Milton Keynes in the UK, where they have these very long walkways and not much interaction between the people. The buildings are no longer enclosing public spaces and creating these adjacencies that you see normally in the more traditional cities on the right for all their problems again. But maybe the way to think about that was that instead of thinking that the problem was mixing people, maybe the problem was the pollution, the overcrowding, the sanitation, and maybe we could, maybe we threw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But again, it's hard to overstate the idealism of this time, the optimism, the sense that the world was on the verge of becoming this wonderful sort of utopian place, especially in the years of World War II, when we were so hopeful that we were leaving those horrors behind us. And you can understand why this became such a powerful model in people's minds for not just the planners, but citizens. This is a magazine ad in 1937, I believe, in Life magazine. And this is an ad for Shell gasoline, petrol. And they're showing a photo of Norman Bel Geddes' model. And they're saying how wonderful it'll be to breeze right over crosstown traffic by 1960. And, we're going to leave these crowded streets behind. You can see the little inset photo there of a traditional street with pedestrians and all the rest of it. You don't have that anymore. You're just going to whisk across town. And again, this is the model that we built very, very successfully and very economically powerful, as I said yesterday, creating a lot of wealth, creating a lot of opportunity for people to advance, to move up into the middle class and have much better health care, much better quality of life, many other benefits, but also many other externalities that are now coming home to roost, as I think we all recognize. And as I mentioned yesterday, we created an interlocking world in which the choices that we make as consumers are predefined for us, the choice architecture, as the behavioral economists refer to it, that essentially removes our choice as consumers. There's this idea that, well, the world on the left is just what consumers have chosen. And that's actually nonsense, because if you look carefully, that world was meticulously planned down to the finest detail. The engineering standards, the standards that the companies have for where their signs are and what their signs are, how bright and sort of noisy they are to attract attention, all the rest of it, all the millions of things that are very specifically designed. And then the consumers are sort of set loose in that environment, and not surprisingly, they behave in exactly the way you would expect them to. They consume, they operate their automobiles, they drive through restaurants, etc. So the choice architecture is already defined for us in that environment. Not as much so actually in the environment on the right. There is a choice architecture there too, of course, but there is also more choice to get around in different ways. You can walk, you can bike, you can drive a car, you can take transit, public transportation, etc. So this idea that the world that we've created is a world that is the product of consumer choices, I think is a very central fallacy that we've got to understand and come to terms with. And I think we've also got to understand that cities are not simply rationally organized components like the elements of a mechanism, the building over here, the street over there. Cities are connective structures, interconnected networks. And I think we'll talk about that more in the course as we go forward. But the idea that cities are dynamically organizing networks of connection between different components, different regions. And this is, of course, the patterns of a leaf, the different elements or the different cells and regions of a leaf that are connected by these capillary tubes that bring the nutrients in to the city. And because of that pattern of connectivity, the leaf is healthy. And if you were to change that pattern of connectivity, if you were to come in and eat a hole in the middle of it, if you're a caterpillar, say, then you're going to create a dieback, not only right where the hole is, but in the broader region around that hole. You're going to disrupt that tissue. So that's a different model of thinking about how cities should be connected, especially when it comes to the street pattern. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. But the idea that you take a rural pattern of transportation where you have an arterial highway that's going, let's say, between two major cities, and then you go off of that and you go onto a collector road in order to get to a smaller town, say. And then once you get to that smaller town, you take a local street to get to the neighborhood. And that is what's called the functional classification street system, the arterial, the collector, and the local street. And that is an essentially rural pattern of street design. What we did in the 20th century is we took that rural model and we forced it into the urban conditions. We created urban arterials. Remember that line about you'll breeze right across town in 1960? Well, that's exactly what we did with the arterials, and in some cases arterial highways going right across the street. Then the collectors that go off of the arterial, and then the neighborhood streets that go still off of those. So you've now lost the main street, the high street, the street that is now the gathering place for people and interactions and social capital and all the rest of it. This is a very fateful change in our ways of thinking about street patterns. Once again, reflecting this larger idea about functional segregation, segregating the parts of the city. So once again, if you think about Ebenezer Howard and segregating the parts of the neighborhood between the centers and the edges, the centers were now, the city centers were now the places of industry, and the edges were now the places of dormitories, residential uses, and so on. The same thing happened at the neighborhood scale. And in Howard's case, he proposed to segregate the garden cities into what he called wards. And that later became enshrined in the concept of a neighborhood unit. Clarence Perry in 1927 proposed this model on the upper left, the idea that you're going to put the major arterials at the edge of the neighborhood, and you're going to put the shopping on those edges, and you're going to put the more tranquil uses, if you will, the parks and the schools and the things that especially the women and children would be involved in. You put those at the core of the neighborhood. You put the commerce and the kind of nasty streets and the nasty activities, maybe the bars where the men go. You put those at the edges. And that was a very conscious decision on Clarence Perry's part to say, look, we think this is happening already, that our cities are being cut apart by, you call them rivers of traffic or torrents of traffic. And let's just embrace that and go with it and recognize that we're going to cut the city apart into these neighborhood units. There was also, by the way, a fair amount of racist thinking in that model as well. The idea that people will segregate themselves into the areas where they want to live with people of their own kind. So you had really, this was not the model of the past, mind you, the idea that suddenly this entire neighborhood unit would be of one socio-political especially economic class, that it would be all wealthy or all poor or all middle class. This was a new model, because if you look, for example, at London, yes, there was some social segregation in London, but there was also segregation within the neighborhood, where you had people living, shop owners living above the store, along the main streets, and then you had wealthier people living on the squares further back. In Paris, you had people living in the same building often. You had the wealthy people living on the floor above the shops, the Piano Nobile, and then you had poorer people living up above them in the where they had to walk up the stairs. So this idea that you're going to segregate people as well as segregate cars, segregate buildings, segregate uses became enshrined certainly in the United States and in other parts of the world as well in this neighborhood unit model. And what you see on the upper right is the schematic. This is from the Federal Highway Administration in the United States. And you can see that it's very close to the Perry model. And if you look, for example, at just about any American, especially city in the Southwest or any of the newer parts of American cities, you will see this model repeated over and over and over again. You have the arterials forming a square, roughly a half-mile square, sometimes it's 1 mile. And then you will have this sort of spaghetti bowl of streets that don't really run through in any meaningful way. Everything is sort of a dead end or cul-de-sac. And then right at the core of that, you have a park and maybe a school. And then all the shopping centers, again, are at the edges of that model. So once again, you're segregating right down to the scale of the neighborhood. And this is Perry's model, again, by the way, where he's looking at how these wards actually work. If you look closely, you can see he's segregating them up into these little slices of the pie, and those are the neighborhood units, or he called them wards. Same idea once again. So again, yesterday I mentioned that we are now on track to produce more urban fabric in the first 5 decades of the 21st. So that should be 21st century. I'm going to change that right now, that typo. 21st century than we have produced in all of human history. And that is a pretty incredible, staggering fact, really, for us to contend with. How are we going to deal with this urbanization? Well, it's already happening. And this is what's happening in many cases. It's following this model of the functional segregation and the segregation of into arterials and collectors and so on into monocultural uses of residential and office and so on. So we have a big challenge on our hands to change that model. We need to understand, again, not only the model of how we're urbanizing, but the model of thinking about it. And later on in the course, I'm going to talk more about Jane Jacobs, and especially the last chapter of her landmark book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, because she talked in that chapter, which is titled The Kind of Problem a City Is, she talked about cities as exhibiting organized complexity, exhibiting this dynamic of mixing and self-organizing into these components that are not planned. They are they self-organize in the way that markets self-organize. I won't go into a whole lot of detail with this now, but what she was essentially pointing out was that our mental models in the sciences have really changed from this idea that we are, forcing an organization on things according to simple variables like the relationship between density and population or population type, or density and location, or any of the sort of 2 variable problems that we were solving for. The 2 variables like the relationship between the pressure and the density of a gas, for example. And in the early 20th century, we began to understand statistical problems where you had lots of elements interacting in average of population. So that was great for understanding statistical problems and problems of things like how to estimate the actuarial tables of life insurance policies, and how to deal with large averages of city populations, for example. But it didn't tell us much about the actual interactions. And that was where the problems of organized complexity came in, where we began to really tease out how this worked as a dynamic phenomenon, how we could begin to understand how many elements related to each other and how they self-organized in relation to each other. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we go forward in the course. But this was a very exciting era in human history, I think, in the mid 20th century. I talked yesterday about Herbert Simon, who was a remarkable person, organization theorist. I think, Dominic, you've probably come across his work. He won the Nobel Prize for economics from his work about bounded rationality, which is related to the idea of choice architecture and behavioral economics. But he also thought a lot about how design works and how problems can be dealt with in decomposition, as he referred to it. You can take the elements of a problem and decompose them into nearly decomposable hierarchies, as he referred to it. They're not exactly decomposable, but you can work roughly with the structure of hierarchies, as he put it in his landmark paper, The Architecture of Complexity. And this was a very important insight that was used by many people in the computer field and in many other fields as well, to begin to understand how to deal with problems of complexity and problems that had many different elements to work with. We would think of these as web networks now, these interconnected relationships, or these crossover relationships that created clusters that were denser connections than they were connected to other regions of a problem. And this was the major insight of Christopher Alexander as well. And we'll talk a lot more about him. His landmark book around the same time, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, where he showed that there was an overlap between these nearly decomposable hierarchies, and that this overlap was very important. It formed a kind of semi-lattice pattern that you could begin to understand as a cluster of more densely related elements that he referred to later on as a pattern. And this was the basis of the pattern language. So this idea of web networks is very, very important certainly in the late 20th century and right up to the present day. The idea that we can understand how things are interrelated in web networks, that this is not a messy, disordered way of organizing things, that it can actually be a more ordered way of organizing things, a more robust, more resilient way of organizing things. For example, the internet became a web network in order to avoid attack. If you had a neatly organized hierarchical structure, all that an enemy had to do was attack the central node of that, and it wiped out the entire mechanism. So Bruno Latour, who we'll talk about in a little more detail later as well, proposed something similar to that when he was thinking about cities and about social interactions and social networks, and something that he called the actor network theory. And the actor here is not just a person. It can be a place, it can be a thing, it can be an institution, it can really be anything. But what he observed was that all of these actors in a city are interconnected in a web network, and the fundamental relationship, or the fundamental structure, is a structure of relationships. This was an illustration showing aging in place and the Internet of Things, smart home technologies, the built environment, and caregiving. That's one example of how the actor network system can work in a given context. And we can begin to understand that and manage that as if we're trying to improve the condition for, let's say, people who are aging in place, seniors, for example, in a city. And this is the idea also that cities are, in fact, immense networks of connective patterns. They build up over time, they transform, they self-organize, we organize them in some ways, we change the way they're organized, but there's a dynamic between, if you will, the top down and the bottom up, the self-organization and the command and control, perhaps, that we intervene as planners. And if we understand this better, we can begin to manage problems like cities, problems like brains or web networks of information. The Wikipedia, for example, is a web network of information, and we'll talk about that more as well. And this idea also that is related very much to Latour's work of third places, that you may have heard this term, the idea that there's a third place or a third object that connects us where we wouldn't be connected before. If you go into a cafe, for example, or a bar or a restaurant, it's not a public space per se, it's a semi-public or semi-private space, but you encounter other people there and you get introduced to them. If you're out in the park and you encounter a dog, for example, you have a social focus on the dog, which is acceptable. Whereas if you walked up to a stranger and said, hello, how do you do? My name is so-and-so, they might find that very awkward. But if you say, oh, this is this is such and such a species, I have one of these too, how long have you had him, etc. Now you have a third actor that is connecting you into this web of relationships that can be very powerful in building up social networks and social capital in public spaces. So this is very, very important. And this is the idea also that it's kind of like the children's game of rock, paper, scissors, if you remember, where you have an interaction between variables. There's not one variable that's on top, so to speak, of the other two. They're all sort of interconnected into a web network. And this was a point that Christopher Alexander made when he was observing the behavior of people at a traffic light. And he was noticing that there was an interactive system of the traffic light, the sidewalk, the newspaper rack that was there, and there was a bus stop. All of these things were interconnected into this sort of rock, paper, scissors kind of relationship. And he observed that that was a fundamental property of cities, that they had these overarching, overlapping relationships, these interconnecting web of relationships, and that was essential. And I'll talk about his great paper, A City is Not a Tree, in more detail later, and what it tells us about the mistakes that we've made in the 20th century leading up to the current day. And so this, in many ways, is the new paradigm, if you will. This is the old paradigm that I've just described, and the beginnings of an understanding of a new paradigm. So let's, for the rest of the lecture, we'll dive into what the New Urban Agenda actually says and some of the details of that. I mentioned yesterday some of the language about well-connected networks, polycentric urban spatial frameworks, et cetera. Very different from what you saw in Le Corbusier and in the Garden City and so on. Going back to 1933, the clearest formulation of the old paradigm, so to speak, was undoubtedly the Athens Charter, which was a document that was actually published in 1943 by Le Corbusier. And there is some controversy about how much he accurately reflected what was agreed upon by the CIAM, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, which was a seminal group of architects and planners who in 1933 took a very famous cruise from Marseille to Athens. And on that cruise, they developed a series of principles that they referred to as the Athens Charter. And the principles were for the nature of cities in the future, how to restructure cities in this more rational way. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the Athens Charter in detail. I think you get the broad outlines of it from what I've already described, the idea of functional segregation and so on. But if you look, for example, at the Athens Charter and the elements of the Athens Charter, and then you look at another document that was created in the 1990s, the Charter of the New Urbanism. And I think you may have heard about the New Urbanism. We'll describe it in more detail later. It's essentially taking the Athens Charter and, if you will, turning it on its head and saying, instead of functional segregation, we're going to have mixing. Instead of segregating automobiles from pedestrians, we're going to mix them. Instead of buildings far away from the street and so on. So let's have a look at some of the elements of the Athens Charter and comparing them to the Charter of the New Urbanism, which in many ways, I think, foreshadows the New Urban Agenda. The Charter of the New Urbanism talks about interconnected networks of streets, supportive physical frameworks, pedestrian-friendly mixed use, preservation and renewal, and so on. And so where you see, and this is from a paper that I published on the subject, I can give you the link to this if you're interested in it, where we took the elements of the Athens Charter and the elements of the New Urban Agenda and the elements of the Charter of the New Urbanism and compared them. So here's the Charter of Athens: function-based zoning, segregated into zones carefully planned according to a rational scheme of spatial allocation. And the actual paper has the quotes pulled out of the Charter of Athens, but I won't go into detail now. The CNU Charter says mixed use instead of function-based zoning. Everything is to be integrated within mixed-use neighborhoods and sometimes within individual mixed-use buildings. The Charter of Athens uses streets as functionally restricted. You're not going to have pedestrians on vehicular streets. We need to kill the street, as Le Corbusier put it. Pedestrians are removed to their own circulation network in superblocks or in grade separated crossings, and streets were now for vehicles only and were going to be widened and spaced farther apart with fewer intersections and access points. And a functional classification system was introduced, as I mentioned earlier. In the Charter of the New Urbanism, we have mixed streets instead of functionally restricted streets. You're going to bring pedestrians and vehicles together. You're going to slow the vehicles down in many cases, or create separations within the street type itself. For example, the multi-way boulevard, where you have some lanes that are fast and some lanes that are slow, and then pedestrians on those slow lanes instead. Segregation of buildings. Buildings are no longer going to enclose the streets and form a continuous urban fabric. Rather, you're going to set the buildings far back, you're going to make them taller, and you're going to put them into a kind of towers in the park environment where they have access to fresh air and light. In the Charter of the New Urbanism, you're going to integrate the buildings again. You're going to bring architecture and landscape design into a physical definition of streets and public spaces as places of shared use. The relationship between the public and the private is now very, very important. And we'll get into that in more detail later in the course, that sort of tissue of relationships between the most public and the most private. And urban design has to create that coherent public space and create the coherent public realm, and avoid what Jane Jacobs referred to as project land oozes, where everything is just this sort of amorphous no man's land that isn't related to private space, isn't owned by anybody, isn't claimed by anybody. It's just this sort of undifferentiated space that then becomes very problematic for a number of reasons. You're going to demolish historic fabric and pattern because it's crowded now and it's unsanitary and so on, and you're going to create more hygienic and functionally efficient architecture. Remember, you're going to wipe out a big section of Paris and replace it with an entirely new structure, and you're not going to create new buildings that have any relationship to the past, because that would be mingling the false with the genuine. You're not going to learn from, and this was a momentous decision that I'll talk about later, you're not going to learn from any of the evolutionary insights of the past up to about 1920. You're going to turn your back on all of it. And in fact, if anybody does something that even remotely resembles any of the architecture of the past, 10,000 years, that is to be attacked as being false, as being wrong-headed. And in the case of the new urbanism, we're going to embrace adaptive reuse of historic fabric and pattern, and we're going to reuse some of the same historic patterns. If they're successful, if they create successes, if they create human delight, if they create good quality, walkable public space that's active, that's thriving, that's economically successful, and gives people opportunities for being in public spaces and getting the benefits of cities, then we're going to embrace that, and we're going to transcend the issue of style. Style is not to be specified, but you can use whatever style you prefer to, and whatever geometries you prefer to, really is maybe a better way of thinking about it, that is going to be successful. In the Charter of Athens, the city is a technical creation by specialists alone. It's going to be rationally planned through a top-down process as a static entity that is then inhabited by by the residents. Whereas in the Charter of the New Urbanism, the city is co-created by all citizens continuously, and they're not only participating in the technical aspects, they're also shaping their own environment to some degree. They're creating the adjustments in their own environment. They're closing doors and opening windows and remodeling their homes and moving chairs around in public spaces and so on, and actually involved in that. So if you look, for example, at the New Urban Agenda, once again, you'll see a very similar contrast. The New Urban Agenda talks about walkable streets, a mix of uses, well-connected, high-quality public spaces, cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. In other words, the patterns of cities that have been successful over time, traditional knowledge and the arts, tapping into all available traditional and innovative sources. So you're going to combine the innovative with the traditional and find the most successful approach that's going to work using an evidence-based approach and engaging the lessons from the sciences. So this is, you might say that where we are is we're still mired in this model, especially when it comes to architecture and architectural design of the high design world, if you will, that is still very much about visual culture and about creating buildings that are iconic. And in some ways dramatic and expressive, and creating contrast, creating excitement, creating profit in many cases, and creating excitement in students who want to create buildings like that themselves, and so on. So this is a kind of a meme that is propagating still throughout the design world that is in some ways displacing the consideration of, well, what is the best habitat for human beings? What is the best habitat for cities? What is the best way to deal with our challenges that are very, daunting urban challenges these days? Because this is in a way a distraction, this idea of architainment, if you will, this idea of buildings as gigantic sculptures, so to speak, that distracts us from the broader questions of how are we making cities and what are cities able to do for people as a whole. So the New Urban Agenda is very much refocusing on that, on the idea that cities are participatory, promote civic engagement, a sense of belonging, appropriate compactness and density, polycentrism and mixed use. Again, public spaces are very, very important, and multifunctional areas for social interaction and inclusion, promoting human health and well-being, economic exchange, cultural expression, and so on. Well-connected and well-distributed networks. There's that key word again, networks of open, multi-purpose, safe, inclusive, accessible, green, and quality public spaces. And you see those words over and over again. And remember that each one of those words was carefully negotiated and carefully adopted, and each one carries a particular weight. Inclusive, cities for all, accessible to everyone, to those with disabilities, for example, green, ecological, and so on. Renewal, regeneration, and retrofitting, as I said before, preserving cultural heritage and preventing and containing urban sprawl, so that you want to refocus on the cores and make them dynamic places that are still accessible to everyone, not perhaps over gentrified. That's another point that we'll come back to later. And again, compactness, polycentrism, appropriate density, et cetera. And once again, you'll see this again over and over, well-designed networks of safe, accessible, green, quality streets. And again, creating the edges of public space and activating the ground floor, the best possible commercial use of street level floors. So once again, we're coming back to the idea that the street and the sidewalk, the lowly sidewalk, are the fundamental places of human contact and interaction. And the building is now going to support that through commercial activities and through nearby residential and other uses, all mixing together. Again, public transport, walking and cycling, the idea of transportation choice, transit-oriented development, mixed income housing, a mix of jobs and services, and so on. So I think you probably came across a lot of that language. I just wanted to highlight some of that, and again, in light of the Charter of Athens, very different, and in light of the Charter of the New Urbanism, very similar. So once again, you're seeing this tectonic shift of thinking away from the earlier model into models that are more mixed, more dynamic. But once again, we have a long way to go in implementation. So if you compare all three documents as I did in the paper, you can see that the Athens Charter has one approach, and the Charter of the New Urbanism and the New Urban Agenda both have another approach: segregated uses versus mixed uses, functionally segregated streets versus mixed streets, buildings removed from the edges versus aligned and enclosing the streets, et cetera, on down the line. So we, in this paper, we picked out the 6 most important factors that were clearly different in the sort of new paradigm, if you will, and the antecedents of the new paradigm in the New Urban Agenda, or sorry, the Charter of the New Urbanism, and in some of the other movements that had happened throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the critical understanding of where we had gone wrong. And again, I'll talk more about Jane Jacobs and her critique, which in many ways laid the foundation for the Charter of the New Urbanism, certainly, and then later on for the New Urbanism. So I think that's a good place to stop for the moment, and we'll pick it up again tomorrow when we talk about the moving beyond the New Urban Agenda and some of the issues that we're going to be exploring next. Let me actually run through quickly what we're going to talk about next. So tomorrow, let me open this. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the Quito Papers and the New Urban Agenda. And if you would please have a read of that document, I gave you the link to it. You don't have to read a lot of it. You can read as much as you want, but please read at least the pages 2 to 3 and 10 to 12. Now, that's an excerpt from a larger book that has been written by Saskia Sassen, Richard Sennett, Ricky Burdett, and Juan Clos. And you can read that if you want to read the full book, or Google that document and you can find more about it. But essentially what they're arguing for is that this is consistent with the more dynamic world that we're in now, understanding how an open city allows for dynamism, allows for growth, allows for opportunity. And in some ways, there's a difference from the Charter of the New Urbanism, because I think Richard Sennett in particular would say that the Charter of the New Urbanism is a bit too static in its approach, still a bit too focused on the designer's role, as opposed to the dynamic processes that go on in cities and how we can accommodate those as planners. So we'll explore that in a little more detail tomorrow. And then actually, as we go forward, let me just review for you what we'll talk about next week and beyond. Going back to the document again. So by the way, after tomorrow, and you can be working on this now if you want to, I need to see a paper from you about 1 to 2 pages that just summarize some of the key points that you drew from the talks and from the readings, and how you think they might relate to your own research. It doesn't have to be long. It can just be the sort of summary version of your understanding of what some of these issues are and how they maybe relate to your research interests, and what you're thinking about as you're moving forward with your research. And then next week, we'll dive more deeply into the work of Jane Jacobs, Christopher Alexander, some of the very interesting offshoots that have come out of that in the world of computers and cybernetics, and wiki and agile methodology management and other things. Then we'll dive the next week more deeply into some of the scientific aspects that have been really expanded enormously since Jacobs wrote about organized complexity and about the sort of dawning age of complex adaptive systems in the sciences, and some of the really remarkable applications that I think we can now apply to cities. That's very hopeful, I think, in many ways. And then finally, in the last week, we'll sort of bring it all together and say, okay, how do we actually make sense of this? How do we use this to deal with our current challenges? And how do we, make progress in the future in actually implementing the new urban agenda and implementing some of these insights to deal with the challenges of the future and to make a more prosperous, a more sustainable future for everybody. So let's take the last 15 minutes or so and give you an opportunity to comment or reflect. What did you guys think? Dominic, I'll put you on the spot first again, of some of the elements of the new urban agenda and how they related to the earlier model, the Charter of Athens. What was interesting to you about that? What do you see relating to your own research, perhaps?
To be honest, everything is interesting for me from the new urban agenda, because I see that all aspects of this document based on relationships. Yeah, as you mentioned during today's lecture, the city is based on relationships. So I see here many opportunities to combine many relationships between different stakeholders. And also, in my case, while describing the relational capital of healthcare institutions, I see also here the opportunity to add some to the map of relational capitals and to the stakeholder maps of these institutions, to add some new branch, the relations between such institutions and between a city as a different body, as well as between these institutions and city institutions, yes, while creating some new healthcare spaces in this case. Yeah. So here I think that it's really good, because in management literature in generally, in terms of relational capital, the healthcare institutions are not connected with cities, with spaces. There are not so many research about it, how the space could create some relational capital. So yeah, here is an interesting point, and in my opinion, some huge research gap in this case, because really this city space can be considered as very important research instrument and tool for creating such capital. Yeah, so here is a very important point for me. And I would also like to add that while talking about industrialization from the beginning of the lecture, our academic city, Łódź, was typical and one of the most famous examples of rapid industrialization in this part of Europe. And Łódź has a medieval metric, but was originally a small village and have in the maybe 18th century only 250 inhabitants. However, later, between the 19th centuries, while starting the 19th century, the Kalisz Mazowian industrial district was formed in Poland. Just a digression, Kalisz is my home city, yeah, and thanks to belonging to the Kalisz industrial district, as well as an immigration of Polish and German citizens and rich houses to Łódź, huge numbers of machines were brought to Łódź and many large factories were built in a very short time. And it was a phenomenon on a European scale, because in just a few decades, Łódź grew from a small village to a large city, which by the standards of that part of Europe was perceived on a national scale as a metropolis. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned also beginnings of concept concepts of city gardens, yes, during this lecture. And I would like to say a fun fact that the first, so also the oldest, and at the same time, one of the most beautiful city gardens in Poland was created just in my home city in Kalisz.
Mm.
Yeah, and during your lecture, you mentioned also that in the new urbanism document, the term of co-creation was mentioned, that the city is co-created. And here I find another reference to one of the management concepts called value co-creation, which is
Right.
quite good defined and described in management literature, which, by the way, can be considered also as a tool for building relational capital. And value co-creation talks about the creation of shared values by different stakeholders from the management point of view. So I see here many contributions and many connectors between such two ideas.
So, you know, I went to a conference in December in the Netherlands. No, it wasn't December, it was February in the Netherlands on, and it was a organization dedicated to the management of public spaces. And this is something that I think we don't think about enough in the world of design and planning. That is that it's not just we create it and then it's there. It's a evolutionary system in a way that has to be managed over time. That has to be, you have to have the management of not only the institutions, you know, the businesses and the public institutions and the governance and all the rest of it. You have to have the management of the space itself, actually. So I think the idea that management is essential to cities is certainly fundamental, and maybe cities are fundamental to management in a way too, because ultimately, whatever it is you're managing is going to have some relationship to the urban fabric and the public realm, and maybe not a good relationship, maybe one that you need to improve. We'll dig deeper in the course into some of the research that's been done that touches on this area, especially when it comes to human health. I mentioned Eric Kleinenberg, the sociologist who did the famous study of the Chicago heat wave in 1995. And he has really, those insights that he formulated as a result of that work have really taken off in this whole realm known as social infrastructure. The idea that it's not just what a person has in their home or in their family or what a business has, it's what the entire community, the entire urban fabric around that home and that business and those people have existing, including the actors, Latour's idea of the actor network of institutions, but also public spaces and sidewalks, and the idea that those have to be part of the purview of the managers. If you as a medical professional, for example, only think to the end of your building, and as soon as the patient walks out the door, you've just treated them for a heart attack and you've given them the drugs and they're okay for the moment, and now you release them out the door. What kind of lifestyle are they going to live, or can they live in that neighborhood? Are they going to be able to exercise? Are they going to be able to walk? Are they going to sit in their car and drive through the fast food restaurant and eat more junk food, which is not going to help their heart, right? So there's been a big movement in the healthcare world to expand the purview of medical professionals beyond just what they see in the treatment room or in the hospital room, to what kind of lifestyle people live in the community, in the neighborhood, what kind of lifestyle they can live, whether they can exercise, whether they can access good quality food. There's this phenomenon known as food deserts, which is where people can't access good quality food for a variety of reasons. Partly it has to do with the severing of the city that we've done, that they can't get to them. So we'll dig into that in more detail. We'll talk about Certainly Eric Kleinenberg, my friend Dick Jackson, who used to be with the Centers for Disease Control and was involved in their work on healthy cities in the United States, improving the healthcare outcomes by working on the quality of the neighborhood, whether it provides all of these health benefits that I was just describing. I think that's really an important dimension of that. And I think, Dominic, we can talk a little more detail about what some of that research is. I mentioned Bruno Latour. You might want to look into some of his work and work around actor network theory. That's a very robust field. I mentioned Kleinenberg. Another subject that you might be interested in is something known as construal level theory. Have you run across that at all?
Yeah, I didn't heard about it.
Yeah, I'll talk about it in more detail later, but it's in social psychology, and it's the idea that if you are removed from the context of a problem, if you are a professional who's in essence has to know it only in an abstract way. You live in a remote city, or you're in a remote building, or you're not actually there on the ground working with the people who have the problem. Then what you have to do is you have to construe what the factors are that are important for that problem, or for that group of people trying to solve their problem. You have to insert your own construal. And this is the idea of the construal level, that if you're more abstracted from the problem, you have to insert your own construal. So if I'm an architect, for example, and I'm not on the ground with the users and understanding how the users react to my building, then perhaps I might construe that, well, what is really important is how symbolically powerful the building is, or what a great piece of art it is, a great piece of sculpture it is, or whatever. I'm not thinking about, well, what's it like to be next to that building day in and day out? Am I likely to walk? Am I likely to interact with people? Am I likely to just, flee that location and go inside the building, or inside some other building, and not be part of the public realm around that building, because that building has now failed for some reason to do that. So it's a very serious problem when it comes to urban design and architectural design, but it's also a serious problem when it comes to healthcare and healthcare management, because again, if you're removed from the problem, whatever it is, then you can only construe your own abstractions in order to do what you think is solving the problem. And you may not solve the problem at all. You may actually make it worse. You may overcomplicate the problem because you don't know the reality. You only know the abstractions, and you're beginning to create all kinds of, sort of abstract rules and processes and construals, things that you're sort of trying desperately to manage the situation, but you're too remote from it. You can't actually control it. So you're essentially making a mess. And this is actually where Agile methodology comes in. Agile is, and I don't know how much you know about that, Dominic, but Agile methodology, which we'll talk about, started in the software world and entered the management world. And it's essentially the idea of getting closer to the problem, getting down to the level where you can actually make it simpler, make the problem simpler. If you're too remote from it, it becomes too complicated. You can only work with these construals, these abstractions, and they tend to overcomplicate and interact with each other and create all kinds of sort of noise and interfere with your ability to actually solve the problem. And this is, unfortunately, a lot of what goes on in the modern world is this sort of overcomplicated, buggy, unsuccessful, cluttered kind of problem solving, whether it's in software, whether it's in management, whether it's in architecture. urbanism in many of our systems today are having this kind of problem. So anyway, we'll dig into a little more detail on some of those topics and some of those researchers, and maybe you'll find a few that will be of interest to you in your research. Mohsen, do you have any comments, any questions, or ways that you'd like to relate this to your research?
Thank you. No, not for now, not for today, because we still. I still think we will, as you said, dive deeper to reach the regeneration, because we are still working on the basic urban theories.
Yeah. So, in this first couple of lectures, I've been sort of painting a very broad overarching picture, and I haven't given you a whole lot of the research. We'll drill down more later into some of the research and specific researchers, like I mentioned, Kleinenberg and Latour and others. And we'll talk in a little more detail, and you might find some more relevant connections to make there with those folks. But I think the main thing I wanted you to recognize in looking at the New Urban Agenda is that it is a seminal document in many ways, that it is a representing a major change in our thinking. And I'll drill down a little more into what the new thinking is when it comes to the new scientific insights into not only environmental psychology, anthropology, sociology, physics, even mathematics, geometry, etc. Quite interesting topics, neuroscience, etc. And we'll drill into those in a little more detail as we go. But the main thing I want you to take away from this first couple of lectures is this: that the New Urban Agenda is in fact, a document that stands in stark contrast with not only the old ways, the old models of city making, which had their reasons, but it also stands in contrast to what we're still doing today. And I think as we go forward into the course, what you'll see is that we're still struggling with how to implement these insights, how to actually change this massive operating system, if you will, of how we've been building things. In many ways, up to the early 20th century, a lot of what we did when we made cities was spontaneous and unself-conscious. Christopher Alexander makes that point in his dissertation, talking about the unself-conscious process of city building. And then we recognized that we were having problems in the late 19th century, and we began to use self-conscious methods of planning cities, very organized and not that they were always unself-conscious. There have always been rational models of city making, as Kevin Lynch described in his book Good City Form. There have been different models of what the city is and should be. If you're talking about the Roman military camps, for example, in the very rigid, gridded pattern, that was pretty self-conscious. But for the most part, most aspects of settlements were unself-conscious up until the early 20th century. And then that began a very major shift towards a more self-conscious model of city making. And therefore, what that model was, what its assumptions were, what its methodologies were, became very, very important. And what Alexander argued in his PhD thesis, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, was that we now had to recognize the obligation of making a self-conscious process, but this time we needed to recapitulate some of the benefits of the unself-conscious process. We needed to tap into that sort of collective wisdom, that evolutionary approach that was clearly so successful over so much of human history in so many ways, and also combine it with some of the more modern approaches and technologies. I mentioned that yesterday, that we in many ways we need to recognize what the last century or so has given us in terms of things that we can use and can take forward, more rational approaches, more in some cases top-down approaches that are necessary in some cases, top-down action, like for example the action that was taken to deal with the ozone crisis, which is now very much on the mend, not entirely, but we don't have the crisis in the ozone hole that we had 30 or 40 years ago. And I think that's an important lesson for us to take forward. So on that note, let's take a break, and we'll reconvene tomorrow at same time, same place. I'll see you then.
Thank you very much for all the information today. Have a nice day.
You're welcome.
Have a nice day.